slido.com, and that's slido.com, and enter the code 9076725. And questions will be moderated. Now, for our audience here live in person, you can also ask questions via Slido, and that's slido.com, with the code 9076725. But to do that, you'd probably want to switch your mobile phones to the Memorial's public Wi-Fi network. Alternatively, you can just raise your hand and someone will come to you with a microphone. Now, I'd also like to thank the Department of Veterans Affairs for the generous financial support of this event, and that has made live streaming this event possible. This afternoon's symposium, Interpreting Australia's Second World War, previewing Anzac Hall, is part of the Memorial's special program of commemorative events marking the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And this program includes free monthly author talks, the season of the play 21 Hearts, Vivian Book and the Nurses of the Viner Brook, a photo and a special photographic exhibition, Victory in the Pacific. This event, this evening at 4:30, there'll be a very special VP Day special last post ceremony outside in the commemorative area. The Governor-General, the Minister for Veterans Affairs, and a dozen Second World War veterans will be in attendance. Now, lift access to the commemorative area will be prioritised for those attending the special LPC, but particularly to our Second World War veterans. If you wish to attend this evening's last post ceremony and require lift access, please allow to give yourself a little bit more time when the symposium finishes at 4 in order to be in the commemorative area by 4:30. In a moment, I will speak to you about Australia's involvement in the Second World War, highlighting the scale, complexity and diversity of Australia's wartime experience. We will then hear from my colleagues Dr. Lachlan Grant, Emily Hyles and Garth O'Connell, who will preview some of the exciting news stories and individual experiences from three of the forthcoming exhibitions that will go into the new Anzac Hall. And these exhibitions being Australians in Bomber Command, Sydney Harbour under attack, and the Battle of Milne Bay. There will be time for questions after my talk, and then again after the panel discussion from Lachlan, Emily and Garth. Okay, so all my housekeeping announcements are over. It's time for the symposium. Let's get started. And please welcome to the lectern the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Matt Anderson, to open proceedings.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dawura Nuna, Dawura Nunawal, Yango Nara Weri Duni Manyan, Nanawawari, Dawura Wari, Ningara Dindi, Wangarari Jinyin. And I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of these lands on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and with their permission speak in their language. And as we do every night here at the Australian War Memorial, I honour those of you who have served, those of you who are still serving, and the families that love and support them. Karl mentioned that tonight we have the last post where we will honour Frederick Emanuel, who was a tank regiment young man who was seconded to the Far East Liaison Office and was, we believe, delivering pamphlets from a B-24 bomber in the last month of the war when he was tragically killed at 25 years of age, within a month of the end of the war. And we'll tell his story in the company of, as Karl's just mentioned, 12 of our Second World War veterans, which will be a remarkable thing. And much of the diplomatic corps will also be represented. Those sort of combative nations will be there laying wreaths to honour the fallen on all sides, which is a very powerful thing to do. But more powerful for me is to stand in front of you today in this place. For those who, show of hands, first time in the Memorial's lecture theatre? Welcome. This is what we imagined. This is how I hoped and prayed the Memorial's new spaces would be used to lead the nation's both commemoration, which we'll do later on today, but more importantly through this presentations or series of presentations today, the understanding of the Australian experience of war. Now, for the first timers here, one thing I would say as I stand on this wonderful stage, which 2 weeks ago was being used by Theatre 180 to tell the story of Vivian Bullwinkle and the Viner Brook. When we engaged the contractors to be involved in this project, we allocated about 10% of the score of a contract or a tender to their veterans engagement strategy. And it was Kane Construction that won this one, and they had a very good veterans engagement strategy and a lot of veterans working on the project. But when we got to here, which is the deepest part of the excavation of the southern entrance, they tipped off some of their mates from the 2nd Commando Regiment up in Sydney, and they drove down and they've wired into the steel reinforcement below this stage the challenge coins of the 2nd Commando Regiment. And as the veterans told me then, they wanted to be involved in this memorial from the ground up and forever. So that's kind of what told me we were on the right track. We were doing the right thing for the right reasons in the right way. Now, you didn't come here today to hear from me talking about Australia in the Second World War. Karl, who has a PhD in that subject, is much more eloquent in that. And of course, listening to Lockie, to Garth and to Emily, they will take you through what it is that we hope to achieve, both in terms of the new gallery spaces in Upper Anzac Hall, but also just the memorial's latest thinking on matters related to the Second World War. So I'll get off the stage, but I really wanted to make sure that you understood this is part of a rolling series of commemorations and activities. This is what the new memorial looks like. These are the things I want to do. Book launches here, I want to have symposiums here. I want this to be a place that leads the nation's thought on the Australian experience of war by having our best and our brightest engage with us. But as much as anything else today, I hope you have the opportunity to think. I hope you have the opportunity to reflect. I hope you have the opportunity to be proud of our nation's contribution during the Second World War. It really was part of our sort of most recent awakening. I argued, I had a chat with the Governor-General earlier on today, and she was asking me about that. Why is the Second World War so important? And, notwithstanding the fact that it swept away the unemployment of the Great Depression, and it brought women into the workforce in occupations, places and numbers that we've never seen before, and some of which remain to this day. But it also, I argue, is sort of the birth of modern Australia. And I spent 25 years of my life in the Foreign Service, and in my first week, first desk was on the United Nations desk, and we were talking about Doc Evatt, striving as President of the General Assembly to place Australia in the world, born on the strength of our contribution during that Second World War. So you're most welcome here today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to be here. You honour us by being here, and I hope this is both thought-provoking, enriching, and most importantly for us, an opportunity to pause and to reflect on Australia's experience of war. And as Lord Gowrie VC said when he opened this building in 1941, before Japan entered the war, he said, when people leave this place, they should utter never again. Thank you for being here. And now, final bit of advertising. I need to sneak out. We have the Governor-General and the Minister arriving at 3:30 to welcome, and I need to be there to welcome them, to welcome the veterans. So if I cut away, it's not because I've fallen asleep, it's because I've got other things I need to be doing as well. And I hope to see many of you at the last post ceremony. But thank you all very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Director. And as you mentioned, this is a very special occasion for us. And really, in many ways, it is a big milestone of getting back to normal and opening a new memorial and our new spaces. But now to bring back to what we're really looking at this afternoon, which is Australia's involvement in the Second World War and commemorating their service and sacrifice. The Second World War was the most destructive conflict in human history. It was a clash of ideologies. It was a war of mass production. It was a conflict that the Western Allies, particularly Britain, the Empire, the Dominions, and then later the United States of America, had to win in order to preserve democratic rights and personal freedoms. The Allies' hard-fought victory over fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and expansionist militaristic Japan came at a heavy cost. Areas of Europe, Asia, and the Pacific were devastated. Tens of millions of people were displaced, and at least 60 million people died. From the 3rd of September 1939 through to the 15th of August 1945, a life was extinguished every 3 seconds. Today marks the 80th anniversary of the end of that terrible conflict. The Second World War was a defining period in Australian history. Yet the complexity and diversity of Australia's contribution to the struggle remain little appreciated. Australia's mobilisation for total war was unprecedented. It has never been matched. 1 in 7 Australians served in the forces during the conflict. More than 30,000 were captured as prisoners of war and suffered as prisoners of war, while some 40,000 died serving in the Australian forces and the Australian Merchant Navy. Areas of Australia's territory in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were invaded and occupied by the Japanese. There are Axis attacks in Australian waters, while the Australian mainland also came under assault. Away from the battlefront, rapid advances were made in the fields of science and medicine, while the wartime economy and growth of industry helped provide the basis for Australia's post-war prosperity. Australia's war began in September 1939. Following the German invasion of Poland on the 3rd of September, Britain and France declared war on Germany. About an hour later, at 9:15 p.m, the Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies delivered an address to the nation. "It is my melancholy duty to inform you," he began, "that because of Germany's invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is at war." There was never any doubt that Australia would play an active role in the conflict. For a nation whose people were overwhelmingly British by heritage and birth, whose dominant values and institutions were British, and whose country's defence and economy were intertwined or intermingled with the British Empire, there was no way, nor was it sought, for Australia to not participate. This would become Australia's largest ever military commitment. Some 990,000 Australians, men and women, would enlist in the forces, and 500,000 served overseas. With only a very small pre-war militia of part-time citizen soldiers, a new force was raised to fight Hitler. The 2nd Australian Imperial Force was an all-volunteer expeditionary force that could serve anywhere in the world. The militia service was limited to the defence of Australian territory, including Papua and then later New Guinea. The militias included some volunteers, so men who were either too young or too old for the AIF, but most, though, were called up or they were conscripted. Many militiamen subsequently volunteered for the AIF, and AIF reinforcements were posted to militia units. During the war, 726,000 men and women enlisted in the army. The army raised or mobilised some 5,800 separate units or subunits. On campaign in 1945, the Australian Army fielded the equivalent of 7 infantry divisions, plus hundreds of combat logistics and support units. Now, the other services grew too. In 1939, the Royal Australian Air Force numbered some 3,300 officers and men. But by 1945, the RAAF was one of the largest air forces in the world, and its ranks ultimately numbered more than 20,000 officers, 144,000 men, and 18,000 women. The Royal Australian Navy expanded as well. From a peacetime fleet of only 13 warships, by June of 1945, the Navy included 150 ships, 200 auxiliary craft, and 200 auxiliary craft. During the war, the RAN lost the heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra and the light cruisers HMAS Sydney and Perth to enemy action, along with 4 destroyers, 2 sloops, a corvette, and an auxiliary minesweeper. Australian forces fought across the world in the Mediterranean, from Bardia to Tobruk and Libya, to mainland Greece and Crete, Syria and Lebanon, and El Alamein in Egypt. Australian soldiers and airmen participated in the Arctic convoys bound for the Soviet Union and flew in the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe. In addition to those serving in the Australian forces, Australian personnel were also attached, loaned or exchanged to the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. Australian airmen fought in the battles of Britain in 1940 and flew on the daring Dambuster raids. A few Australian prisoners of war participated in the famous Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3 in 1944, only to be recaptured and executed by the Gestapo. Likewise, in 1941, Australian naval personnel died when German battleship Bismarck sunk the battlecruiser HMS Hood in the North Atlantic. Later in the war, Australians participated in the Allies' invasion of Sicily in 1943 and Normandy in 1944. Australian men and women also served in British and Allied forces in East Africa. They fought at Monte Cassino in Italy in 1943 and participated in the Allied airborne drops in Arnhem in Holland in 1944. Australians can even be found crossing the Rhine into Germany in 1945. Elsewhere, individual Australians participated in the campaigns in China, India and Burma, and indeed Australians are known to have been active participants or bore witness to virtually all of the defining moments in the Second World War, even the misery of the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-43. Closer to home, Japan's attacks on Pearl Harbour, Hawaii, and the invasion of southern Thailand and northern Malaya in December 1941 changed Australia's war overnight. Australia and its allies scrambled to meet this new threat. The Japanese advanced rapidly through Southeast Asia and across the Pacific. By January of 1942, the Japanese forces occupied Australian Mandated New Guinea, but the greatest blow came when Singapore fell on the 15th of February. Only 4 days later, Darwin was bombed for the first time. Embittered defeats were also suffered on Timor, Ambon and Java. The Australian Prime Minister John Curtin described early 1942 as our gravest hour in our history. Australia has never been so vulnerable. The mainland will be bombed nearly 100 times. Darwin and Northern Australia bore the brunt of this assault, but Japanese submarines also attacked Sydney Harbour and Newcastle. By the year's end, however, the Japanese thrust in the Pacific had been blunted, with the Allies winning crucial naval victories during the Battle of Coral Sea and Midway. And hard-fought Australian victories were won in Papua, at Milne Bay, along the Kokoda Trail, and the bloody beachhead battles of Buna, Gurna and Sanananda. During 1943 and early 1944, Australian and American forces launched a major offensive against the Japanese in New Guinea. These operations were the largest offensive ever conducted by Australian forces, employing the equivalent of 5 divisions, a greater part of the RAAF and most of the RAN. During 1945, Australian forces were more heavily engaged in the conflict than at any other time, conducting or participating in 7 separate campaigns in New Guinea, New Britain, Bougainville, Borneo, and the Philippines. Australian forces were at the peak of their efficiency. They were experienced, well-trained, and able to successfully conduct large-scale amphibious operations, such as the landing at Balikpapan on Borneo's east coast on the 1st of July, 1945. It was the Australian prisoners of war, though, who possibly had the most diverse experiences. The Japanese employed prisoners of war as a disposable labour source. Work parties from Singapore were sent to all parts of Japan's conquered empire, to Borneo and Indochina, to Burma, and even Japan. Among the 22,000 Australians whom the Japanese captured, the 14,000 who survived endured sometimes horrific conditions. Now, when compared to the military prisoners of war, however, the plight of some 1,500 Australian civilians interned by the Japanese has received scant attention. In islands across the Pacific, Australian civilian administrators, plantation workers, missionaries and their families were caught in the maelstrom of war. Some women and children were evacuated to mainland Australia, while their men became coast watchers in New Guinea or the Solomon Islands. The less fortunate, however, were captured by the Japanese at places such as Rabaul, Madang, Nauru and elsewhere. Meanwhile, on the Australian home front, Prime Minister Curtin's government mobilised the population, economy and industry for total war. The federal government enacted a series of unprecedented restrictions and controls over the daily lives of Australians. Curtin's mantra became all in. Now, Menzies had first used this phrase in 1940, but it was Curtin who made it his own. And this was not mere political rhetoric. With zero male unemployment and ever-increasing demands for labour, in early 1942, Curtin's government established the Manpower Directorate to impose a form of industrial conscription. All adult Australians were issued with identity cards, and it was the Manpower Directorate who decided where an individual worked. Rationing was another ever-present reminder of the war. Tea, sugar, butter, meat and tobacco were all rationed, and there were shortages in milk and cream, eggs, beer, fuel, coal and textiles. Rationing and an austerity campaign, which was zealously promoted by the government and the press, meant that goods such as pink icing sugar disappeared from wedding cakes for the duration of the war. And to limit consumer spending and curb festive excess, Christmas advertisements in 1942 were prohibited from mentioning Santa Claus or Father Christmas in their ads. Now, wartime necessities saw a period of engineering and technical achievement. Although the country was yet to manufacture a mass-produced motor car, Australia's industry rapidly modernised and expanded, designing and manufacturing aircraft, landing craft, armoured vehicles, and an arsenal of weapons. This industrialisation helped form the basis for Australia's economic prosperity in the years following 1945. It was also a time of great social change, most obviously for women. In a moment, you will hear from Emily Hyles in greater detail about the experience of Australian women at war. More than 66,000 women served in the forces and in non-combat roles during the conflict, and thousands more began working in factories and other traditionally male occupations. Now, when peace came in 1945, these women, who played a very vital role during wartime, were then expected to return to their homes to again become wives and mothers. But they fostered in their daughters the spirit of independence and equality that helped drive the women's movement of the 1960s. Now, wartime also offered other opportunities too. Some First Nations Australians serving in uniform did experience a degree of equality with white Australia. Despite the restrictions on their enlistment, over 3,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders served directly in the military, and thousands of men and women were employed as labourers and workers in Northern Australia. For far too many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander veterans, however, this period of equality proved fleeting. Garth O'Connell will be speaking more specifically about the wartime experience of First Nations Australians shortly. After 6 years of war, on the 15th of August 1945, the Australian Prime Minister Ben Chifley announced to the nation, "Fellow citizens, the war is over. The Japanese government has accepted the terms of surrender imposed by the Allied nations." Rejoicing broke out spontaneously across the country with wild scenes of celebration. It was, Chifley said, a glorious moment. The war in Europe had ended 2 months earlier, with the surrender of German forces unconditionally on the 8th of May, a week after Hitler's suicide. The formal surrender of Japan took place in a ceremony on the 2nd of September on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Now, Australia suffered during the Second World War, but it did escape the worst excesses of destruction, oppression, and enemy occupation. Australia emerged from the war confident with a new and independent outlook. Australians enjoyed a more sophisticated relationship with Britain and found the United States a new and powerful ally. In the years to come, post-war immigration from war-torn Europe created great diversity amongst Australia's population and society. Now, Australia's Second World War is not a simple story. The courage and bravery shown by Australians at Tobruk, at El Alamein and Kokoda, and the endurance and sacrifice of Australians on Banker Island, the Burma-Thailand Railway, and the Sandakan Death Marches have made some experiences quite well known. But concentrating exclusively on major military campaigns or atrocities, however, can overshadow the variety and significance of Australia's contributions to the conflict. Australia's war was one of competing narratives and priorities. If then there is a single common observation, perhaps it is simply this: that these men and women defiantly stood against and defeated fascism and militaristic expansionism. Unlike earlier commemorations, this year's anniversary holds a greater sense of relevancy and urgency. As of last week, the Department of Veterans Affairs estimated that there were only 981 Second World War veterans still alive. The men and women who fought the war are now nearly gone. So too are those who worked for and supported Australia's war effort on the home front. But the legacies and consequences of the Second World War remain with us still. The war resonates through the current conflict in Europe, geopolitical tensions in Asia, and political uncertainties elsewhere. Many of the post-war assumptions, norms, and alliances that we, the Western allies, inherited from our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents are currently being tested. Possibly our greatest tribute to those Australian men and women who fought the war is to not forget their sacrifice or their achievements. Nor should we take for granted the security, stability, and freedom that we enjoy today. We cannot afford to be deaf to the echoes of the Second World War. Thank you. Skipped too far ahead. I have time for a small number of questions, both from the audience and online. If you're online, again, sligo.com and enter the code. Yep, just up the back.
Thank you very much. That was a really excellent presentation. I think that's one of the best succinct summaries of Australia in the Second World War I've ever heard. How did Australians get to Stalingrad?
There's a war correspondent who was there reporting on the front, basically.
Okay.
Yep. And you probably won't be surprised, but we had Australian war correspondents who were everywhere, quite diverse fronts from all across Europe, one in Stalingrad, India, Burma, and now we can look on Trove. You look at Australian wartime newspapers, they're actually filled with stories from the war from other fronts. It's quite exciting. But yeah, there's one guy in Stalingrad up. Just so. Oh, just sorry, if you just wait for the microphone, sorry. Have to make David run.
Yeah, just on that, one of my mates, Colonel Templeton in the Army Reserve, father served in Russia, and he had all these medals on him. We couldn't figure out where they came from. That's all.
We do find Australians serving all around the world, particularly in British forces. So normally, for example, we have Australians in British forces. There's 2 serving with the 3 in the US Army, and there's 2 in the Canadian Army in D-Day and D-Day Plus. Question over here. Yep.
Karl, thank you for that excellent and very succinct presentation. Just a very simple question. Was Bougainville, for the purposes of consideration of militia and eventually the
militia bill?
Yes. Was that considered Australian territory or not?
Yes, it was a British protectorate, which then we pay. Yes, basically, yes, it was. So hence they're able to deploy the militia there. After they made the change in 1943 to the militia bill, then deployed militia units. But you do find the combination of militia and AIF units on Bougainville in that 44-45 period.
Is there any remit within the War Memorial for the war at home?
We do cover the war at home. So in terms of the home front, it's featured in the galleries. We also collect on the home front experience, so ration books, dresses, a range of different activities. Is that what you meant?
The economy, the strikes, everything that happened within the Australia
Yes,
due to the war.
Yep, So that's part of our act in terms of the consequences of war, the experience of war. The galleries themselves, the current Second World War galleries are a little bit old. We think they're about 30 years old, and I think they're due for a refresh. And I really do feel that when we do a major refurbishment of the permanent Second World War galleries, we'll have to have a much greater experience on the home front. Because it really was an every man and every woman's experience. Everyone is involved in the war, some shape or form. It's not just the military forces. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just interested in, you mentioned conscription for the Second World War. You hear a lot about First World War conscription in Vietnam. I've never been completely clear on how it works with the Second World War. Are you able to outline that a little bit?
Yes, so with the Militia Act, everyone 16 or 17 over had to register, and they were literally given a telegram and they were called up and conscripted into militia. So Granddad's story was that he just received a telegram one day saying, yep, report to Liverpool. So we're from Wollongong, report to Liverpool, and bring your own cut lunch, and I got a free ticket and went to the army camp. Because of the tensions around conscription, and conscription specifically for overseas military service, and that was a hot point in the First World War. So Prime Minister John Curtin, this is great irony, Curtin during the First World War had been an anti-conscription campaigner. He knew how spicy the topic was. So when there was the need to introduce conscription and then send those forces to places such as Papua New Guinea, deliberately avoided using the word conscription. Hence they used this, they were called up. So it was very much the same thing, but just avoided the language. Right at the back.
Thank you so much for such a great, succinct presentation, as everybody else has already stated. I'm just wondering, with Australian-born members of, say, the British Army, like Sean Hackett, who commanded 4th Parachute Brigade at Arnhem, will they get their own statues or other acknowledgements here at War Memorial as well?
So increasingly we're looking at doing more work uncovering, because basically we do need to uncover and rediscover these lost Australian stories, such as people like Hackett. There's a whole range of different people we're looking at, and we're looking at probably doing them new ways, such as publications, talks. A new work that my colleagues and I are working on is looking at Australians' involvement in the Normandy campaign, and that includes a number of Australian men and women serving directly in the British forces. So the first thing we need to do is find out who they are, rediscover their stories in many ways, interrogate them, and then look for those opportunities to tell that bigger, broader experience. Because there's Australians everywhere. It's incredible. Just down the front. Sorry, Mick.
Thanks again also for your presentation. It was very interesting and thoroughly researched, obviously, and very interesting. In terms of training camps for Australian soldiers, I've heard Liverpool, Moorebank, Holsworthy all mentioned in connection to that. Were they all separate camps, or are they different references to the same training establishment out in Western Sydney?
They were separate, similar sort of training. They took on soldiers at different points. It was a bit tricky because there are military camps all across, particularly the east coast of Australia, as well as in the other states. And sometimes it's basically just bringing a showground, being called up, turning up, getting the basic training, and then before they moved on to more specialist or core activities. There's a whole range of different camps across the country, as well as airfields and flying establishments. There's a whole range of them. It's just a little bit tricky these days because most of them have been built over, developed, now suburbs, and particularly the ones in and around, I guess, Greater Sydney, they've all been just merged into the outer suburbs. But there's loads of them.
Yes. All right, thank you.
Or there were loads of them, I should say.
Hello, Karl. I'm a bit on the POW side of things, And I'm just wondering if there's any consideration given to increase that 22,000, because I know there was 26,500. Has any work been done to update that number?
Well, I know you're leading the charge in that field, but while we talk about these numbers and figures, we're constantly changing, learning and adapting. So, for example, with the new criteria and asking new questions, we're making these new findings. So these numbers can go up all the time. They're not hard, like one would think they're set in stone or cast in bronze, but even say with the Roll of Honour, we now have over 103,000 names commemorated on the Roll of Honour, whereas a few years ago it was 102,000 names, because we're doing more research, finding new stories and trying to interpret and interrogate their source. So certainly they can come up in the future. I might take one more question before we move over to the second part of our presentation.
Just in relation to the more uncomfortable stories, how does the War Memorial propose to deal with issues such as Major Charles Cousin from the 8th, who was captured at Singapore and then ended up running the Japanese Imperial English language radio service and managing the various Tokyo Roses, and also Albert Stokes, who was captured at El Alamein and ended up involved with the British Free Corps, which was a very small unit of Allied prisoners of war that ended up fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviets for the SS.
Yeah, there's a small number of Australians who do that. There's also a number of Australians, or people who were born in Australia, and then after the First World War, then deported back to Europe, and they end up fighting in the German forces as well. So in the same way, we're looking at Australian, or people born in Australia who are serving in the British forces. There's also a small, well, there might be more than we think, but certainly more serving in Axis forces during the war. The first thing to do is to look at the records, ask those new questions, and to be comfortable with those to get used to asking uncomfortable questions and to come up with those answers. And certainly that will be an interesting challenge to look at into the future when we redo the permanent Second World War galleries. But on that perfect segue, I will now throw over to the second part of the event this afternoon. And I will introduce my colleagues, Dr. Lachlan Grant, Emily Hyles and Garth O'Connell. And they are part of the curatorial team who've been developing the 5 new exhibitions that will go on display on Level 1 in the new Anzac Hall next year. Dr. Lachlan Grant is a senior historian in the military history section and one of the leading concept developers for the Level 1 curatorial team. He is the author and editor of 4 books and is a specialist in the Second World War historian. A curator with a strong interest in aviation and women's history, Emily Hyles started the memorial 14 years ago and has worked in many different roles. She is deeply involved with the curatorial development of several of the new exhibitions that will soon be on display. And a proud Gomeroi man, Garth O'Connell is an objects curator and another key member of the team. He's also a long-serving soldier in the Australian Army, and he deployed in peacekeeping operations to the Solomon Islands and participated in several other operations. Now please welcome Dr. Lachlan Grant.
Okay, welcome and thank you all for coming today for the preview of the Second World War exhibitions that are going into Anzac Hall. My name is Lachlan Grant and I'm a senior historian and concept developer of the Second World War and First World War exhibitions that are going into Anzac Hall. First, I'd like to provide a bit of an overview. The new Anzac Hall will be split into 2 levels, which is something quite different. The exhibitions I'll be talking about today are on level 1. This space includes the following Second World War displays: the Australians in Bomber Command, centred around the Avro Lancaster G for George; Sydney Harbour under attack, the Japanese submarine raid on 31st of May 1942; and the Battle of Milne Bay from August to September 1942, one of the key turning points in the Pacific War. Also featured on level 1 are the Sydney-Emden Battle, from 1914, the first victory of the Royal Australian Navy from the very early days of the First World War, and Kandahar Workhorse, Chinooks in Afghanistan, 2006 to 2013. And then on the lower floor, level 0 of Anzac Hall, will be the Modern Conflicts and Peacekeeping Galleries, featuring the War in Afghanistan 2001 to 2021, Australian Peacekeeping 1947 until today, and Conflict in the Middle East from 1990. On level 2, there will also be a mezzanine which will provide a view of Anzac Hall as well. And the mezzanine will also include some small displays and temporary exhibition space. But as today is VP Day, marking the end of the Second World War, our panel discussion will focus on that conflict today. But stay tuned and keep your eyes posted on the Memorial's website, socials, WM magazine, for highlights of the Modern Conflicts and Peacekeeping Galleries as we get closer to the opening date. As well as myself, the curatorial team working on the Level 1 galleries, fellow concept leader and senior curator Shane Casey, who's in the crowd today. If you want to put your hand up, Shane. Shane's up there. As well as Emily and Garth. Dr. Karl James has been the concept developer on the Chinook exhibition, which is also on Level 1. There have been many more memorial staff behind the scenes who have all made significant contributions to the project, but we don't have time to name them all today, but it's a huge team effort from hundreds of people across the memorial to get these galleries together. Across the 5 exhibitions on Level 1 of Anzac Hall, there's going to be a total of 684 objects. The 5 exhibitions on this floor will tell the stories and individually name 390 veterans and their families, so individual stories throughout the galleries. Our floor also includes some 41 multimedia and audiovisual displays. Some of these show films from the War Memorial's collection, historical films, but some are digital interactives that have been designed to let visitors take a deep dive into a specific topic. The largest of our exhibitions in Upper Anzac Hall is Australians in Bomber Command, documenting the journey from enlistment, training to flying missions over German-occupied Europe. This exhibition tells the story of perhaps the most dangerous theatre in which Australians served in the Second World War. Of the 10,000 Australians who served in Bomber Command, more than 4,100, that's 41%, were killed and have their names listed here on the Roll of Honour. Centred around Lancaster G for George, the experiences of Australian and British Commonwealth aircrew who served in Bomber Command is also told through 338 objects, of which George is just one. He's the centrepiece, obviously. The exhibition tells the stories of 241 individual veterans and their families. And many of the objects and stories in this exhibition have been collected by the memorial in recent years. And we estimate that approximately 70% of the objects going on display in the Bomber Command exhibition, for example, haven't been displayed before. So these are stories of individuals which haven't been told in the memorial's galleries. So they'll be told for the very first time. So as a team, we think that's really exciting. Our team faced a number of challenges in creating and curating these displays. The major challenge in these galleries is that they're all newly interpreted. They're newly created and newly curated. We've not sort of simply just returned the display from old Anzac Hall as it was. In doing this, we had 80 years of scholarship to consider, which was also another major challenge. And there was all kinds of different advances, as you can imagine, across the different stories and different themes through the galleries. Taking this into account involved featuring the experiences and voices of civilians. Someone before mentioned the home front during Karl's question time, but also stories of Papuan communities at Milne Bay, for example, but also thinking about the people on the ground during the bombing campaigns in Europe, whether it be in Hamburg, Berlin, London or Coventry. There's also been 80 years of collecting from the memorial. The development presented really a once-in-a-generational opportunity for us to survey that huge collection of materials we've got held in our storage to ensure we're representative and telling the fullest story of Australians in Bomber Command and Milne Bay and Sydney Harbour as we possibly could. One advantage of this also allowed us to identify where there are gaps in the collection. And then reach out to community for objects and stories to fill those gaps. And one example pictured here was the donation from the family of Flying Officer Keith Mills, an Australian airman who was incarcerated at Buchenwald concentration camp. From the very beginning, we wanted to make sure we included the voices of veterans through the exhibition. One way we have done this is by drawing on quotes from the memorial's large oral history collection from the Second World War, as well as documents, the diaries and letters in our private records collection. And throughout our galleries, on the key theme panels, the personal story panels, and many of the object labels, they start with a quote from the veteran who owned the object of this that we're telling in that showcase. One thing that we're very focused on, while the displays are connected to large technology items such as the Lancaster, the Kitty Hawk or the submarine, was to ensure that the galleries are really telling the stories of people. You may have heard claims throughout some of the media that we're displaying what they call big boys' toys, but this is simply not true and has never been the case from the perspective of the curatorial teams involved. The big objects, which are what we call at the Memorial Large Technology Objects or LTOs, they number 13 in total in level 1 of Anzac Hall. So they make up just 1.9% of all the objects going on display. That's 1.9 of the 684 objects on display throughout all of Upper Anzac Hall. Our gallery is about the people, the men and women who served and experienced war, as more than 40,000 of whom lost their lives in the Second World War and have their names listed here on the Roll of Honour. It's our jobs as memorial historians and curators to interpret their wartime experiences. We recognise the importance of returning... sorry, I just lost my spot here. So it's our job as memorial historians and curators to interpret their wartime experiences, and objects such as G for George or the submarine from Sydney Harbour is central to doing so. G for George is not just an impressive aircraft, it stands for the experiences of so many Australians who served and lost their lives in Bomber Command. Another challenge for the team was to make sure that while we've renewed and modernised these exhibitions, we recognise the importance of returning some of the stories and objects that resonated with visitors in the past. An example is the letter home and uniform of Flying Officer Colin Flockhart pictured here. So long-time visitors will find some familiar touchstones, but there will be lots of new stuff and lots of new stories for people to discover. So what are some of the highlights? From the curatorial team's perspective, there are many, but we only have time to mention just a few examples of what's new in today's presentation. One exciting aspect for our team is the diversity of stories that are going to be presented throughout our galleries. For example, the Bomber Command exhibition contains stories of Australian men and women from all backgrounds, from all trades and professions, from every region, state and territory from throughout Australia. The exhibition follows the journey of aircrew from enlistment through training at schools in Australia, Canada and Britain to joining operational squadrons. And from enlistment to joining an operational squadron typically took 2 years. So it's a significant part of the story, and we wanted to make sure that full journey and the story of Australian aircrew in Europe was part of the exhibition, and it wasn't just starting with the day that they flew their operations. The themes that follow this look at life in England and life on base, and then the experiences of combat. This, of course, includes stories of those who are killed, or where Australian aircrews are buried in Europe, and the Bomber Command aircrew are buried in something like 600 cemeteries across Europe. But also how families at home in Australia, mums, dads, wives and children, learned about the fates of their loved ones. We also look at the prisoner of war experience, stories of evading and stories of evasion, evading capture. And we consider the complex legacy of the bombing campaigns in Europe, using the voices of veterans themselves as a point of reflection. Another highlight was researching and building interactive multimedias to enable visitors to discover more about the people and the stories behind the objects that are going on display. In the case of G for George, an interactive touchscreen will allow visitors to examine all 93 operational flights George undertook, including 89 completed missions of George's service career with 460 Squadron. For each mission, visitors might learn about will learn about the people who flew George with a personal quote about what happened and what they saw. The stories reveal, for example, that George didn't survive without a scratch. We often talk about it as being a lucky aircraft, but it was actually damaged on some 27 occasions, and sometimes quite severely. So on average, if you looked at 3 of the missions, you'll find that on a particular mission, an engine might have been knocked out or it was hit by flak. Each mission also provides info about what happened that night, how many bombers were dispatched, how many were lost, and what happened on the ground. The target, the destruction caused, and the casualties. And we have a picture here of what the interactive looks like, but you'll notice part of it's upside down. But that's because it'll be a flat table, so multiple users can use it at once from either side of a table. Up to 4 people will be able to use it at once. And this is really exciting because it enables visitors to share discoveries with friends across the table and provides a really great interactive and shared learning experience. Another familiar object to you that will be returning to the galleries is the Schnaufer tail fin. We'll include with this one a digitised touchscreen alongside this Messerschmitt 110 tail fin from the German fighter ace Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer. In its previous display, there's very little interpretation of this object, and what was there, the story was centred around Schnaufer himself. But Schnaufer's tail fin is stencilled with 121 aircraft, representing some 830 British and Commonwealth aircrew who were shot down. Among them are at least 47 Australians. The touchscreen enables visitors to find out who some of them were, where they are from, and the circumstances of their deaths. Among them is Flying Officer Geoffrey Silver, pictured here. Silver was a professional weaver from Canterbury and Sydney before he volunteered for the RAF. He survived being shot down by Schnaufer and evaded capture and made it back to England, but sadly he later lost his life serving in Coastal Command when his Sunderland aircraft went missing over the Bay of Biscay. We hope that this approach will humanise the object, connecting it to the experiences of Australian servicemen in a way that the story of the German flying ace pilot did not. In the Sydney Harbour exhibition, a major change that visitors will recognise is the submarine will be displayed at ground level. This is done specifically to improve the visitor experience by bringing the object closer to the public. Visitors will be able to see inside the submarine where a section is separated. A screen will also provide a virtual X-ray view of the control room to provide a perspective on the cramped space in which the Japanese submariners worked. At one end of this gallery, a large map is projected on the wall with a timeline that will track the journeys of the 3 submarines that entered Sydney Harbour on the night of the attack to give some sense of the events as they occurred throughout the night from 6 p.m. until about 6 a.m. the next morning. The stories of the 3 submarines are not linear. They all have their own separate journeys. Turning our attention to the Battle of Milne Bay, this exhibition considers the environmental conditions and the horrific nature of jungle warfare as experienced by so many soldiers in the Southwest Pacific area of operations in the Second World War. Here you can see a uniform of an Australian soldier being prepared for display. This display was inspired and modelled on the drawing that you can also see here by the official war artist William Dargy, which was sketched at Milne Bay in October 1942. Also shown here are some of the artist's impressions of the new gallery. Curatorially, a major highlight of this exhibition is that it brings together two of the memorial's most iconic objects relating to the Second World War for the very first time. This is the P-40 Hawk fighter aircraft named Polly and the Japanese Hargo tank, both of which saw action at Milne Bay. It is quite unique for a museum to have two such technology objects whose service is so connected. And Anzac Hall is quite special because, although we're not talking about today, we also have the Sydney Emden guns too. So this is the second exhibition in that second time in one hall that we have such a connection. Previously, the Milne Bay story was scattered across 3 locations throughout the memorial's galleries, so the development provided us the opportunity to bring them all together. Now, Kitty Hawk and the Polly and the Hargo tank will be presented together for the very first time. So this is one of the great outcomes of the development, and being able to tell this story of Milne Bay as representative of the jungle fighting in Papua New Guinea and Bougainville and New Britain and other places in the Southwest Pacific in the Second World War. A favourite among the curatorial team in the Bomber Command exhibition is the full display of a uniform, kit and equipment as would have been worn by a tail gunner. This was inspired by memorial traditions, such as the display of Private Giles' uniform from 1918 in the First World War galleries, which was collected by Charles Bean in France in 1918, and Lieutenant McShane's uniform from New Guinea in 1943, displayed in the Second World War galleries. We chose a tail gunner for this display as perhaps the least glamorous position on the aircraft. There's quite a lot of attention that gets given to pilots and navigators. This showcase will house an impressive 48 objects. That's how much stuff a gunner would have taken onto the Lancaster with him. And these items include the various layers of protective clothing worn when facing freezing conditions to what he would have had in his pockets, rations, evasion maps, escape and survival equipment. But what we have also done is we've chosen not to mount the display on a mannequin, but instead to spread it out so visitors can actually see all the 48 objects, because otherwise they're just all in his pockets and it just looks like a uniform. So we want you, and this is going to be a great one for our education team, I think, because the school kids will really be amazed by all this stuff that they're carrying with them that go into all the different pockets and layers. As I've noted, most of all, the highlights in these galleries are the hundreds of stories of individual Australians. From all our team, it has been a great honour to have worked on this project. We hold a great respect for the generations who endured 2 world wars and the Great Depression. And as custodians of their stories and collections, we are passionate about learning more, about getting details right, and we've shown great care and compassion in sharing their stories with the Australian public. In many cases, we've been touched by the stories we tell and feel that we've come to know personally some of the men and women whose stories we tell in the galleries, even though we've never actually met them personally. The galleries can only really name a few of them, but we wish we could personally name and acknowledge all of them. But those whose stories are in the galleries are there as representatives of all who served. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleagues Emily and Garth, who will take a deeper dive into some of those personal stories.
Good afternoon. I feel very, very fortunate to have worked on this project with this team. It's a rare opportunity to work on a curatorial project of this scale and this significance. And today I'm going to share some of the new content and objects which will appear in our Bomber Command galleries and which I hope will be of interest. Explicitly, we'll look at women's service and women's involvement in the Second World War, and more specifically at Waddington, Wormald, Weddings, Wool and the WAF. And that alliteration wrote itself, it really wasn't planned. Perhaps it's good to start by considering what we already know about women in the Second World War. And this is probably the widely held, accurate, but oversimplified idea of women's sock knitting, fundraising, and writing letters. And yes, these are women knitting, but they are also WAF tractor drivers waiting for a call on the loudspeaker to drive bomb-laden dollies to the aircraft. And there they are. We're probably familiar with the dichotomy about gender norms of the time and women's capacity and ability to engage in men's work, and the very real need for them to do so. As this recruitment poster attests, Bomber Command is a man's story, but it also depended on the work and support of a lot of women. My hope for the new Bomber Command exhibition is that our visitors will note the role of women in this campaign, not just as a tokenistic, unnamed group of gals digging for victory or driving a bus, but personal stories about the British and Australian women who supported our men in Bomber Command. But back to my W alliteration, and first to Waddington. 5 kilometres south of the cathedral city of Lincoln lies the airfield of RAF Waddington. During the Second World War, Waddington was the home base for 2 Australian bomber squadrons, number 463 and number 467 Royal Australian Air Force. And here's Lancaster Nick, the Nazi neutraliser of number 463 Squadron, being rearmed and refuelled at RAF Waddington. Waddington was typical of the 100-odd airfields in eastern and northern England from which bombers flew almost every night to strike at targets in Nazi-occupied Europe. Airfields like Waddington were small villages and home to over 2,500 personnel. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAF, were vital to the operation of a Bomber Command squadron, and over 180,000 women served in the WAF in the Second World War. And for this talk, you should assume I'm talking about the British WAFs rather than the Australian WAFs, who have one more silent A in their acronym. And the Australian WAFs did huge amounts of important war work too, but were not connected to Bomber Command, a campaign which, training aside, unfolded entirely in Europe. WAFs lived in the delightfully named WAFery and worked in a multitude of roles on bomber stations. And if technology permits, I'll share a snippet of a new Bomber Command exhibition which features an interactive digital map table of RAF Waddington and examines the service of the wonderful WAFs. By 1943, more than 180,000 as projectionists, photographers, signallers, radar operators, photo analysts, operational researchers, meteorologists. WAFs prepared and issued emergency equipment, including pigeons on bomber stations, flying kit. They drove crew to their aircraft, waved them off. They issued directions from the control tower and debriefed crews upon their return. A WAF was the last voice aircrew heard when they left, and the first voice they heard when they returned from a mission. And I put this image of cricketing WAFs in just because I like it so much. WAFs shared in the successes and failures of the squadron, and the high numbers of missing aircrew weighed on them heavily. WAFs also provided great cheer around the base and boosted morale, which leads me to weddings. 2,000 Australian airmen, just under 1 in 10, married British women during or immediately after the Second World War. For airmen in Britain on leave, London was the magnet. There were plenty of cinemas, laughs and sing-alongs at music and dance halls, wall-to-wall pubs, and the chance to meet a young lady. RAF men were enthusiastic sightseers and visited the homes of their relatives, as well as taking up generous civilian hospitality schemes such as the Lady Rider scheme. This much-needed social activity gave RAF Bomber Command men a lifelong love of the British. And incidentally, Lady Frances Ryder was an extraordinary woman. She's here on your left. A member of the British peerage, she set up a hospitality scheme for Dominion airmen far from home to stay with British families during their leave periods and have a semblance of normal life, if only for a day or two. And the image on your right shows a group of Australian airmen at the Newman family home. The Newmans opened their home to hundreds of airmen from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa and Poland between 1941 and 1945 as part of the Lady Rider hospitality scheme. Despite the dangers, hardships and deprivations of war, love often blossomed with great joy and passion, and weddings followed. Arranged in haste and with pooled rations making up the wedding reception, leave restrictions and imminent bombing raids led to a sense of urgency, and weddings were often modest events. Many brides were members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force who had met their husbands during their own wartime service. WAFs were not only valuable to the war effort, but were a terrific social balance for aircrew. The new Bomber Command exhibition features a War Bride's digital flipbook to give visitors an insight into the joyful social experiences of Australian aircrew in England. So a visitor will approach the 21-inch touchscreen, the binding of which will look like a 1940s photo album, and by swiping their finger to turn the page, they can view a composite album of about 20 Bomber Command weddings. And text on screen will describe how the couple met and married, an overview of the operations the groom took part in, the work of the bride, and what became of the couple post-war. In such a sombre campaign as Bomber Command, with such a high rate of attrition, this display, more than any other in the exhibition, hopefully will evoke joy in our visitors. And now we'll have a little sample of some of those weddings. And on screen, we've got Warrant Officer Kevin Dennis, CGM 462 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, and Miss Olive Jones. In a Halifax bomber raid over Frankfurt, Dennis, severely wounded by flak and nearly losing a foot, continued his duties as wireless operator until his aircraft landed. Just 20 years old, he was awarded a Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. And at the wedding reception, guests enjoyed a 2-tiered cake, which contained 24 fresh eggs. No mean feat when the ration in 1945 was 1 egg per person per week. Typically, marrying couples would pull together rations to achieve a modest wedding cake, or they could rent a plaster cake with decorations from the local baker. And on your right, Flight Lieutenant David Shannon, DSO and Bar, DFC and Bar, 617 Squadron, Royal Air Force, and Section Officer Miss Anne Fowler. Shannon, a pilot of number 617 Squadron, was the most decorated South Australian flyer of the war. Only 21 at the time of his marriage, Shannon had already made many raids on enemy territory and was famous for the part he'd played leading the Dambusters raid on German dams. He met his future wife at RAF Scampton, where she was a WAF officer. A real baby face, Shannon had grown a moustache to try and make himself look older. The day after the Dambusters raid, Shannon proposed to Miss Fowler, and she agreed on the condition that he shave off his moustache. And you can see here that he did. And here we have some more lovely Bomber Command couples, all young and joyful, including on your far right, Warrant Officer Carlton Younger of 460 Squadron RAAF and Miss Margaret Gilby. Carlton Younger of Melbourne was a navigator with number 460 Squadron. On a bombing raid to attack an aero engine plant near Paris, his aircraft was hit and he bailed out. He was captured after a week on the run and became prisoner of war. Christmas 1943, he received a Dear John letter from his sweetheart in Australia. One can only imagine the blow. Sometime later, while still prisoner at Stalag Luft 3A, Younger was informed that he had been adopted by an English girl, Margaret, who would write to him as a wartime pen pal task. She would also send him cigarettes. As an aside, Nancy, Younger's sweetheart who had dumped him by post in penitence, also sent him cigarettes. After liberation, Carlton married this pen friend, Margaret. So it's a lovely album. Of course, some of our young grooms failed to return, and other marriages did not last. My favourite anecdote is of a London girl, a former WAF, who married a RAAF tail gunner from the bush, and post-war, she came to Australia on a bride ship, moved to his family property near Coonabarabran, embracing country life, raising 4 children in fairly austere conditions, and experimenting with exotic local ingredients like emu eggs in her fruitcakes. One of my W's was Wormald. Jack Wormald was a 19-year-old clerk from Dulwich Hill, Sydney, who enlisted in the RAF in October 1941, training as a pilot. His 2 years of instruction took him to number 466 Squadron. On the night of 15th February 1944, Wormald and his crew took off from RAF Lecklenfield to bomb Berlin. En route, they were attacked by German night fighters and shot down over the Netherlands. All the crew were killed. They were later buried in a local churchyard at Opende. A neighbourhood Dutch woman, Johanna Hardinger, took it upon herself to care for those graves. She made the effort to track down Jack's family in Sydney, wrote to them, sent photos of his headstone, and even, touchingly, sent them a packet of pressed flowers that she had placed on his grave. This is in our collection, and it will be going on display for the first time. In an era when family could not travel to a loved one's faraway grave, this small act of kindness would surely have meant a great deal. Not strictly the domain of women, but often the case, the care of a burial site on the other side of the world by a stranger demonstrates compassion, empathy, and humanity. I visited this site in Sydney. It's in a small park in Dulwich Hill, which is near Marrickville, and the memorial plaque is still there, though heavily overgrown with vine today. It's inscribed with words Jack's mother chose to remember her only son. God gave thy brave soul wings, my son, my son. And the dog in the picture, Peter, had belonged to Jack Wormald. And in Jack's letters home, which are part of our private records collection, he always signs off and pats for old Peter. Thanks to the age of the internet, we can see those graves, and I found evidence that the parents of Jack Wormald were also in touch with the people of Opende, Netherlands, because affixed to the small wall behind the crew's graves to this day is a small plaque in the shape of Australia on which are the words, Mr. and Mrs. Wormald, Dulwich Hill, Sydney, wish to thank the people of Opende for the loving care of this monument erected to the memory of our beloved son Jack and his crew. And now we'll turn our attention to the subheading of wool. An interesting object new to display is the sheepskin flying vest of Jack Murray. Flight Sergeant Jack Murray, DFM, was a pilot with Bomber Command, In fact, he flew the Memorial's G. George on 13 operational missions. And if you're interested, the multimedia that Locke referred to earlier about the missions that George undertook, you can see Jack's missions are represented on George's sortie log with a red sash. But it's his sheepskin vest, autographed and illustrated, that I want to talk about. It has a small woven cotton tag attached to it with the letters CWAV, 4 letters that belie the enormous efforts of a small group of country women. Early in the Second World War, members of the Country Women's Association of Victoria discussed ways and means of helping the war effort. Mrs. Carolyn MacDonald, here on your left, organised the sheepskin vest scheme, and with a small group of energetic country ladies appealed to farmers to donate sheepskins, railway authorities to donate transport, fellmongeries to tan the pelts, and the country women of Victoria to make and distribute the vests. And the response was immediate and overwhelming. And on the upper right, you can see Mrs. Falls, 74, actually shearing excess wool off the pelt prior to sewing up the vest, and below, the end product. No part of the sheepskin was wasted. Offcuts were made into gloves for the RAF, mittens for the Navy, and slippers for hospital patients and civilian children. And by war's end, the Country Women of Victoria had given 14,000 sheepskin vests to fighting forces and a further 1,000 vests to POWs being repatriated to Australia. They had also sent 6,566 pairs of gloves and 3,545 pairs of slippers to war-affected civilians. A remarkable effort by a small group of women intent on doing their bit. And that was just one part of what they did. They did loads of other useful activities. Here they are working on camouflage and aerial supply nets to drop supplies in from aircraft. And Australian women reconditioned military uniforms and towels. They sewed, they knitted, they worked tirelessly, and often in hats and pearls. The final part of the W is an Australian woman serving with the WAF. As I mentioned earlier, Australia had its own Women's Auxiliary Air Force with an additional A for Australia. But in this instance, our woman, Jean Starling, was in England at the outbreak of the war and joined the British WAF. Excuse me. Jean Starling was the librarian at Canberra Community Library at Acton. And in mid-1938, she left Canberra to study at the University of London. She completed a library degree and stayed on, working at the Oxford City Library. At the outbreak of war, Starling joined the British WAF as a specialist image interpreter, serving at the Central Interpretation Unit at RAF Medmenham. This unit played a crucial role in the planning stages of most RAF operations and with every aspect of intelligence. Starling was one of 1,700 women who analysed and interpreted thousands of negatives and prints captured daily by cameras in bomber aircraft and from bomb damage assessment units. Scrutiny of such photographs with this very stereoscopic viewer made it possible for Jean Starling and other photographic interpreters to view enemy activities in 3D and prepare detailed intelligence reports for commanders. After the war, Starling returned to Canberra and worked at the National Library, which in the 1950s had a staff of 3. Just before I conclude, and this is not in the new exhibition, but I want to clarify, in Bomber Command and in the Second World War generally, women were not allowed to fly operationally, but members of the Air Transport Auxiliary were. 80 female Air Transport Auxiliary pilots ferried military aircraft from British factories to RAF bases around the country for use by operational squadrons. And of these 80 pilots, there was one Australian woman, Marty Gething. a qualified pilot by the age of 18, and accidentally in London at the outbreak of war, she was initially rejected for entry into the ATA because of her diminutive stature. Astonishingly, Marty flew 42 different aircraft types in the course of the war, and often 3 different types in one day. ATA pilots frequently had to fly unfamiliar aircraft with little or no training in that particular aircraft type. And perhaps of interest to you is that Marty flew in G. George as George's publicity officer on the Victory Loan Tour of Australia in 1945. After the war, women found themselves relegated to the home once again as men returned to civilian life and society returned to a new version of the old status quo. But the tides had shifted, and the example these women set during the Second World War ignited a confidence in their own and subsequent generations of women. Today, our Defence Force promotes equity and diversity through inclusion. The new galleries of Anzac Hall are peppered with the stories of extraordinary women in Rwanda, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Bomber Command. Women who took enormous risks and did extraordinary things. Thank you, and I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Garth O'Connell.
Thank you very much, Emily. I'd like to like to follow up with my colleagues' excellent presentation so far, and to thank you all for coming as well today, and for those watching online. Today, my presentation is called First Nations Stories, a exhibition's preview. And my name is Garth O'Connell, and I'm a curator here at the Memorial with the Military Heraldry and Technology, and also the Gallery Development team. I'll start with a very brief personal introduction. As to me, I'm descended from my father's family from the Wallaroi clan of the Commemorate people from northwest New South Wales, around Moree and Terry Hi. I'm also got Irish and British ancestry. One of my first Anglo ancestor to this big beautiful continent was a Irishman in the British Army, John Hannon. He was in the 13th Light Dragoons on day 2 and 3 at the Battle of Waterloo. He accepted a job to come to New South Wales to escort the convicts, and he took up a wife in Kent, England, brought her out here as well, and his garrison was Newcastle, and he ended up settling in the Hunter Valley, which is where he later on joined the New South Wales Mounted Police. My hero is the man with his rifle out the furthest in the photo behind me here. That's my grandfather from my mother's family, Brian Francis O'Connell. He's at Tobruk in a posed photo by Frank Hurley in April 1941 with the 2nd 13th Battalion. He was later wounded and evacuated out of the siege. This is the only grandparent I ever met, and that was my father's mother. And this is at my first birthday, my grandmother Noreen and my uncle Ian in the background. That's me at the age of about 6 or 7. I decided I wanted to work here at the War Memorial. And I've got proof to show you in a minute as well. That's me as a young Air Force cadet with 7 flight at Regent's Park 2 Stores Depot in Sydney. I was growing up in Western Sydney. And I loved aeroplanes, still love aeroplanes today. But I didn't join the Air Force. This is a birthday card for my mother, this was made when I was age 7. So this is 1982. And her birthday, I've converted a Lancaster bomber to have her initials, Sharon Ann O'Connell, and 39 victories to donate to missions. And that's what I based it on. My favourite aeroplane since I was a little kid. G. George, Lancaster, which I've got the privilege and honour of working with here the last couple of years especially. This is a photograph of me in 2008 as an infantry section commander on Operation Anode in the Solomon Islands with my section and my good mate Dave Doe holding up my Aussie flag, which is in my garage at home here in Canberra. And of that photo, I think 8 of us are from the ACT. So there's only 2 NSW lads in that photo. And if you don't know what a curator is, which is a common question I get at family barbecues, events and friends and family, a curator is a noun, a keeper or custodian of a museum or other collection. And I've been on staff here since, like a full-time, since the year 2000. And I've met and worked with so many amazing people, such as my colleagues here to my right. And the team we've had the last 5 years working with Anzac Hall has been a really big highlight of my career. I'll just give a very quick background or information-y sort of thing, like some context as to why and how it was hard for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen to even join the military in World War II legally in Australia. And one of the actual clauses was you had to be substantially of European origin or descent. And that was part of the fight before the fight, which was the fight to enlist. The hardest thing for these men and women was the first initial enlistment door. Once you're through that, you had a lot more equality, equal pay, equal rights and so forth. And the experiences of these men and women have today manifested with multiple generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders having their dad serve, their granddad, their great-grandfather and so forth. It's a really big thing. And at the moment, I believe I think it's 4 to 5% is the enlistment rate of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in our Defence Force, which is higher than what our proportion is in the regular civilians in our civilian society. I'll get that off my lips. These are some of the men who did get through that what they call a colour bar during the World War II, and includes in this photograph 3 men of Bomber Command. Up until only a couple of years back, we only knew of pretty much 1 man. Now, these laws weren't just to discriminate against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but also against Asian Australians and Eurasian Australians, such as these men here. And one of these men here, Mr. Leslie Fang Ewan, we've got one of his uniforms in this exhibition in Bomber Command. And he was a navigator in World War II in the RAAF. And one of his mates there, Mr. Tung Yep, have also got objects of his in the collection. But that's just to show you some examples of how this law wasn't just for First Nations people, it was also for our Asian Australians as well. One example of this law, which came into effect, affected this young man, Reginald Jeffrey or Jeff Barnes, and he wanted to be a pilot. And it was quite a big media event in South Australia and across most of Australia during the early parts of World War II. This is an enlistment photo, and there's some newspaper articles off the superb Trove website, which is the National Library of Australia's asset. It's a truly amazing resource. Every newspaper scanned and so forth, going back to early 19th century. So here's the first known Aboriginal person to join the RAAF and so forth during the Second World War, but he tried about 6 times and got knocked back every time for having the wrong physique, among things. And this is one of the, this is on his file, which anyone can access on the National Archives of Australia website. I have dear sir, this is from the Aborigines Department. If you don't know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, our rights were done by the states back then, up until 1967. So the states had their various laws and restrictions on our people. And in South Australia's case, they've written to the Air Force of the No. 5 Recruiting Centre at North Terrace, Adelaide, saying, dear sir, I have the pleasure in advising that the Aboriginal Protection Board, very ironically named, has given consent for Reginald Jeffrey Barnes to enlist in the Royal Australian Air Force. The board has also agreed to exempt him unconditionally from the provisions of the Aborigines Act 1934-1939. Mr. Barnes is now regarded in law as a white man, and I have no doubt that he will uphold the high traditions of the Royal Australian Air Force. A tick in the box, and he's white. This is Australia in 1941. By the way, to go back to him, he ended up becoming an electrician in the Air Force, and worked with 13 Squadron, which operated our Hudsons and then later on our Lockheed Ventura aircraft. And then he went to B-24 Liberators, and his last squadron was 201 Flight, which is like a very unusual and rare unit in the Royal Australian Air Force involved with electronic warfare. And that was his last his last Air Force post, and so he did actually get to see overseas service, but in the role of a ground-based electrician. And so he's not as well known as this man here, Uncle Len Black Magic Waters. He got through, and you can see him here with his graduation class at the second operational conversion unit in 1944. Him in the cockpit of his Kitty Hawk, his Black Magic aircraft, which he did not name. He had that aircraft already named that, but serendipitously that was his most common aircraft he used. And we found out several years ago that we've got an aircraft he flew in training at Wagga, actually near Wagga at Uranquinty. And we've got this Wirraway in our collection which he flew twice in like 1944, which is a really unusual and rare thing, which I'm really proud to be involved with. Polly that we've got on display in the Milne Bay exhibition isn't just for Milne Bay. It's also to represent the highly significant role that the Kitty Hawk aircraft type did during the Second World War for Australia. In the Western Desert, over Northern Australia, such as the defence of Darwin, former War Memorial volunteer Dick Cresswell, Mr 77 Squadron, up there on the right there next to his nose art. You've got Clive Caldwell in the middle up there, Uncle Len again in his cockpit of his Kitty Hawk. 112 Squadron, RAF in the desert, that's actually a real colour image, not a colorised photo. 450 Squadron, Desert Harassers in Italy in World War II, late in the war, with very proudly having a boxing kangaroo with a slouch hat. Australian Kitty Hawks again in like the Balkans Air Force over Yugoslavia during the war, again in Kitty Hawks. And I also consider it a representation to the American Army aviators that also helped defend Australia during World War II. The only aerial defence of Darwin in their first attacks on Darwin was entirely by the United States Army Air Force flying P-40 Kitty Hawks, or what they call Warhawk. And that's Bill Hennon in the front there, of the 7th Fighter Squadron, who actually adopted a bunyip, an Aboriginal animal, as his logo, and the squadron still today in the 7th Fighter Training Squadron of the US Air Force still uses the bunyip as their squadron logo. Look it up if you don't believe me. The 7th Fighter Squadron, bunyap they call it, and it's called the Screaming Demon. That's what the Americans call it. But they still, 80 years later, have adopted this emblem. The reason being, I found out, was because a lot of their guys were like parachuting out over Northern Australia and being rescued by Aboriginal communities. And as a form of recognition, he did that. Back to Aboriginal aircrew, World War II. This man here is Roy Hill. He's from the Wadati Nation of Western Australia. He was born in Busselton, Western Australia. He was a pilot of a Lancaster. And 106 and 189 squadrons, that's him zoomed in from the photo. And this photograph will be on a mega graphic on a wall, pretty much almost life-size, I think. So it's going to be a huge wraparound of this very photograph to show people the diversity of the most international air force in history, which was the Royal Air Force of World War II. Men from all across the Dominions and the Commonwealth. In this photo here, you can see Aussies by the darker shaded uniforms compared to the RAF's more grey-blue uniform. And there's also, I can see in like the high-resolution image, there's also most likely Afro-Caribbean British airmen there I can see, and also South Asian men as well. So this is this photo I'm really happy to see is going to be on display in the new Bomber Command exhibition. And the thing is, they're all mates, they're all equal. Harry Edgar Aldridge. This is Harry. He's in an army uniform because he was in the army first, then he transferred to the Air Force. And he was again in a Lancaster. And all this work's come through our research during this process and through the good work of our Indigenous Liaison Officer, Michael Bell. He's, with his massive networks, has come across a lot of communities and families who said, oh yeah, we had a great uncle who was in the Air Force, we don't know what he did. Guys like him, he's like a navigator in a Lancaster in 1944-45. Really cool. Errol Ingram, school teacher by trade before the war. He was born up in Maitland, Hunter Valley Way, and he flew in the same squadron, 622 squadron, as like the previous fella. So he had 2 Aboriginal airmen in the same unit. His job was a pilot, nicknamed Blue. And I've got the photos here to show the one in the middle is this is By Jove, which shows a Waddington-based Australian squadron by the JO, you could tell the JO code. And they are helping to repatriate Australian and Allied POWs from Europe back to England. And the furthest image on this side here with the Lancaster dropping food to starving Dutch civilians in Operation Manna. Errol Ingram did 7 missions as a pilot dropping food to Dutch civilians. And he did one flight, bringing back POWs, and he did 7-day and 3-night operations late in the war. Dave Valentine Paul, who was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He's a pilot of a Ventura aircraft, and he was shot down by a German fighter pilot called Fritz Gramotka, and was made a prisoner of war. And this photograph in the middle is being included, is in the Bomber Command exhibition, again as a large enhanced sort of graphic. And this is the Anzac Day March at Stalag Luft 3 in Germany, Anzac Day, and he had the privilege and the honour of leading the march and taking the salute off the officers there lined up. And at Stalag Luft 3, there was a significant number, of course, of Bomber Command aircrew. After the war, he came back to New South Wales, and he was one of the first New South Wales police airmen. And he used to fly Avro Ansons, and that's his Anson which he flew as well. And there's a Trove article there of him getting arrested by a lady on the street, and you can see him wearing his pilot wings on his police uniform and his medal ribbons, which I think is really cool. He died at his office at RAF Base Richmond in 1973 in the Air Force Reserve. Oh, and his brother Max, younger brother Max, we interviewed and spoke to years ago, and he told us, yeah, we knew who we were. We were like pretty fair skin coloured, but we're always told to not talk about it, not go on about it, just to get in and get on with our lives. And he said it wasn't until the last 20, 30 years he's been able to talk about and acknowledge and like his Aboriginal ancestry, which he knew about because his mother's family. Lindsay George Walker, this is his great-great-grandparents, which we work on. Every single one of these men I'm showing you, we've done through our valuable assistance from our like genealogists, track the entire life back to their known Aboriginal ancestors. This is Jonathan and Margaret Goldspink. She's from the Darug Nation, which is in Sydney Basin. He was born out west though, and nicknamed Whiz because he was pretty quick at picking up things. He joined the Air Force at 18. That's him in his photograph there, colourised photos, a sergeant pilot, and he flew Halifax bomber aircraft. In 1944, they were on a navigation exercise over the rival mountains in Wales, and in 9/10 cloud, they sadly impact the side of a mountain, and all the crew were killed whilst flying with a heavy conversion unit. And that's his burial plot in Wales today. Taken by a member from the Goldspink family who we're in touch with. His story is also on our website, as well as part of the Like Indigenous Stories. Alfred Charles Parsons, another Bomber Command airman. Again, this work's all come through this work involved with our Anzac Hall. He was a navigator with a Wellington bomber aircraft, the 104 Squadron. And he was involved in a fatal crash in 1942 at Driffield in England, a future airfield for one of our 464 Squadron units. And he was killed in a takeoff accident where the pilot sadly selected the incorrect flap settings. As it turns out, in the whole crash report you can look up on the National Archives website. Makes a real sobering reading. He was wounded and then died 10 days later of his wounds and is buried in Yorkshire. Another section which where we are going to have some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen in it, but it isn't quite obvious at the get-go, is with our Milne Bay exhibition. And one of the most recognised photographs of that campaign is this photograph here, which was used on a cover of a book by the Australian Army History Unit in their campaign series by Nicholas Anderson. And the caption for this doesn't mention any of the fellows' names, which is very common and not unusual. Milne Bay, Papua, 1942, September. A patrol from the 61st Australian Infantry Battalion of the 7th Brigade, AMF, crossing a river while searching for Japanese in the Milne Bay area. But not long after looking at this photo, about 5 years ago, me and a few of the colleagues went, I feel the fellows look a bit brown there, like they could be Aboriginal. So we started to put our feelers out and looking through photos and names and getting in touch with unit histories and historians and who are they? And we've been able to identify positively 2 of 3 Aboriginal servicemen we reckon we can find in the photograph here. And we've amended the caption to correspond with that. And if we're lucky, I'd love to find out every single course man's name in this caption, in this photograph. This guy at the front, second from the front. There's a guy fourth from the front with his front upper teeth missing. I guess that was done in theatre, not before he joined up. You wouldn't have been able to get past like the MO. And the third last man, the rear last man's actually got a P14 sniper rifle over his shoulder when I looked in the high res, which is quite unusual to see in a photograph. Most Aussies think of the Lee Enfield rifle number 1 Mark III, but this one's a bit different. So there's 3 guys we've identified, and we started to put our feelers out and ask around, and thankfully I was able to find out who the back guy was first. We identified McClellan Richards of the 61st Battalion, and one of the leads I got was from a book called 5 Years in the Army by James Watt, and he was a veteran of the 61st Battalion. And I looked up the PDF file online, and then I put in words like the surnames. I put in Aboriginal, and then came across other hits, and then I found names, cross-reference those against the National Archives and then against the DVA website. And we were lucky to find a confirmation here. And it's so good to get these little bits of evidence and be like a detective and sort of suss it out. I don't go as far as having like one of those crazy walls with all the red lines and things yet. I'll be close to it sometimes though. We also identified the second guy with his front teeth missing, Private Edward Curry. And he's a Mununjali clan elder from the Yungaba nation up in Queensland. And they're like traditional countries around Bow Desert, and that's where he was born in April 1922. He enlisted in 1941, and he had 5 children. And we also cross-referenced their service files, which indicates when they left Australia and went to New Guinea or Milne Bay, and it says the dates. And that all corresponded with the time the photograph was taken in September 1942. So we're always corresponding and cross-referencing all these leads. So that's him there. And then a later photo with his teeth. Just prior to his death, sadly, in the early 2000s. But it's a really good photo, and we got in touch with the family, and they did not know about the photo existing. So when we let the families know, they're so happy. It's like if I found a photo of my hero, my pop in the photo, other ones, I'd love it. And so my mum and her siblings, and my cousins. So back to this photo. It's going to be a big mega graphic on a wall, and that's a render of how it will look. Please ignore the empty-looking display case. There is things going to go in there. But yeah, that's just to show you sort of like an idea of how it's going to look. So I'm really proud of that. And that's one of the Milne Bay things we've got there. The next part, I want you to imagine if you're at Milne Bay, or codenamed Fall River, during the war on 28th of August 1942. Your job is a young Australian Army or Air Force member on a crash boat, and your job is to dart around Milne Bay during the daytime, not at night, and your job is to look for any of our crashed airmen and go rescue them, and also to help communicate and spread messages around the bay. A bunch of these guys are out of radio contact for 3 days, and they get to Milne Bay and they're told that the Japanese have broken through. And they go, oh no, that's not good. The Americans, at the same time they're ashore at Milne Bay, start shooting at cows that come into the perimeter, thinking they're Japanese in the wire. They start shooting, putting up flares. An Australian kitchen detonates and blows up all their supplies. The guys think it's on, they've taken the airfield, it's time for us to get out of Milne Bay. So at 9 o'clock, they leave Fall River, and I've put a little map together showing you Wagga Wagga on the south coast of Milne Bay, and I've done a bit of a dot map of where they went. And at about 2.5 hours later, the 5 men on that little crash boat, which is at the bottom left down there, 0805, they come across a Japanese Navy destroyer called the Urikaze, and it's pitch black conditions, and it gets to within 50 yards of them, and they're sitting there probably panicking, going, this is not good, because at night the Japanese owned Milne Bay. That's when they did their supplies up and down, and they used to get the searchlights out, and they would do attacks and so forth and bombard our troops and their ships and our ships. And these men were caught. They were hit by automatic weapons off the side of the Urikaze, and it blew up. 2 members of the RAAF on board went missing straight away, and 1 army guy later died. But the 2 army guys survived, Private Farah and Donegan. Donegan is wounded by shrapnel to both legs, and he's a fractured right wrist, but he floats with no life preserver for 18 hours. And he floats, though, from that star to roughly where that circle is. Problem for him is he's now behind Japanese lines, and he's wounded. The other fellow, Mr. Farah, drifts south and is picked up 8 hours later, and he had a life preserver on. What helped keep Donegan alive was he was ex-Royal Australian Navy before he joined the Air Force. And he used to fix, his job on that crash boat was to fix the engines. And that was a photo of him taken as a 30-year-old man, a pre-war plumber from St Kilda, ex-RAN reservist, fixing engines, and he was on that motorboat, which was attached to 32 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force flying Lockheed Hudson bombers. This is a report on the National Archives website, which goes into detail about his incident. As I said before, 18 hours, he drifted ashore, right across Milne Bay, and got ashore at a native village where the Japanese were between him and the base. He was wounded. He was tended by the natives, and when the Japanese entered the village, the natives carried him out and hid him in the bush. If they had seen that, they would have executed the local people on the spot and used them as examples. So they're like doing this support under the threat of death. A native nurse, and they do it by like phonetics, Margura of Davana village cared for Donegan and used up her stores of bandages, etc., on him. The natives sent a canoe across the bay to Mr. Coleman of Labo Labo and informed him of Donegan's plight. A launch was sent across and Donegan was brought back to Gilly Gilly and immediately placed in 75 Squadron, which is a Kitty Hawk Squadron, which our Polly's from, hospital, and evacuated by plane to the mainland. And Donegan had promised her, the nurse, at the village that if he gets back to safety, he would give her a bicycle, 1 lady's raincoat, a pair of spectacles, 1 box of Aspros, 7 yards of dress material, and a sweater, which he duly went through with later on. Point 9, it is considered essential that these articles be provided in order that the natives will be encouraged to assist air crews and any others needing assistance. It must be realised that the Japanese become aware of natives were hiding and tending any enemy that will be executed a number of the natives, and so forth. So, and one thing to remember is these local Papuans are technically Australian sort of citizens. So for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Servicemen and Women's Association, we consider Papuans to be the 3rd Indigenous people until 50 years ago this year when they become independent. This is what she was given, a Medal for Loyal Service, and we've got this example we put on display in the exhibition to pay tribute to men and women like her. And that's a photo of her with about to be given she's been given her medal after Nurse Margaru and Major General Morris, the head of ANGAL, which is the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit, a very important unit up there. And this is her lovely smile taken right after that ceremony. And this photo will be included as well, and I'll show you in a second where it's going to be included. This photo is also in this part as well. The man standing right next to her, the tall man with the fairer coloured skin, he's the future first Governor-General of Papua New Guinea, and he was the first one from 1975 to 77. Sir John Guise, later GC, MG, KBE. There's some really good interviews with him online if you look up YouTube, for example. And one of his jobs, which I didn't know about till I found out about this incident, was that he was told by Angkor, Japanese advancing up in ships in Milne Bay. He went ahead of them and was telling villagers, put your lights out, put your lights out. It's believed that he helped contribute to their navigation error in landing in the wrong spot at Milne Bay that first night. And that's one reason why he gets a medal. Angkor recognised that during and after the war. This is a mock-up of the display, and you'll see the loyalty medal there, photos, and so forth, which I've spoken about. Do you have any questions? Pause for. Oh, sorry. Actually, yeah, I will. Well, thank you for that. I'll pass over now to Karl Jones.
Once Garth starts, he doesn't stop. But we do have time for questions, both people online as well as here in the crowd. We're a little bit pressed, so please keep your questions succinct and keep your answers succinct. Question over Ian.
A question for Ms. Hyles. The members of the WAF who married during the war, were they able to stay in the service, or were they compelled to leave the service like colleagues of mine were in the 1960s and 70s?
Yes, I'm afraid they were compelled to leave. Marriage was career ending.
All right, question now there, and there's a question online.
Lachlan, you talked about the Bomber Command training progression. Does that link with the Empire Air Training Scheme display in Aircraft Hall that features the Avro Anson?
Yes, of course, it does link up with the Aircraft Hall. There is the Empire Air Training Scheme, which is the program they're all training under. But there'll be less of the training scheme story in Aircraft Hall, and it'll be sort of part of the Bomber Command exhibition. So the presence in the galleries now, the main story of EATS will be in the new Bomber Command gallery.
A question from online asking, I'm interested in getting a real sense of just how thin the defences were after the fall of Singapore and the Netherlands East Indies. The REN virtually gone, no AAF, and the REN virtually gone, no AIF, and just the RAAF left. Question for Garth, Locke.
Oh, well, I mean, I may as well jump in here. This is why the story of Milne Bay is such an important one, and it's one of the key turning points of the Pacific War, of course, happening at the same time as Kokoda as well. Milne Bay is the story we're essentially telling in the galleries, because we have a really good collection of objects to tell the story of Milne Bay. Of course, as a museum and gallery, we need objects to tell the story. Unfortunately, I think, I'm not sure what the reason why, Garth might be able to add, but the reason our collection relating to Kokoda in terms of objects is quite sort of thin is just because of the nature of the fighting in the mountains and in the jungle, and equipment didn't come into the memorials collection. But Milne Bay being right on the coast, objects such as the tank were recovered and brought back to Australia, and people's uniforms and bits and pieces and weapons came back home too. So telling the story of Milne Bay, but 1942, it's such a crucial year for Australia in the war and globally as well. And the story of Sydney Harbour, which also includes stories of details of the bombing raids on Northern Australia in Darwin and other locations, Broome and elsewhere too. So Australia was very vulnerable at that time, and that's why actions such as Milne Bay are very much in the defence of the Australian mainland. Hugely important story to tell.
Cheers. Thank you, Locke. Any other questions? Oh, just in the centre? Yep. And the centre, and then there's one right at the back, the second. So 1, 2, and then 3. Oh, 1, 2, 3. You get the mic, you can speak. Yep. 1, 2, 3, go.
Yeah, my question is about the Japanese tanks at Milne Bay. I'm aware that one of them got sent here, in the War Memorials collection, but what happened to the second tank?
The second tank both tanks were put into private collections after the war. During the war, they were both run over mines to test out anti-tank mines, and that's one reason why you'll see with our Type 95 Mitsubishi Hargo tank, it's on a box because the hull, the bottom part, is actually wanting to split open like a banana peel. But our conservators and so forth were able to put the hull onto a box and secure it to that. And that's why there's heavy damage at the bottom of that vehicle. Both went to private collectors after the war, and the other one is still in a private collection, as far as I understand. I believe it's in Australia still, that second tank which was landed at Milne Bay.
Question number 2. Oh, no? Right. The question up the back. Right at the very back.
Perhaps a very easy one. Is the G for George cinematographic thing that was run every half hour in the old hall, is that coming back or revamped?
Yes, it is coming back. It's been revamped, but in the old Anzac Hall, if you remember, you could watch from up on the mezzanine, and it was very much what in the museum industry call object theatre based. But now, because that sort of stopped visitors from visiting the exhibition during the times that the film is, we've actually got a discrete sort of more theaterette up the back, in the back corner of the exhibition, where that film will be shown. And we've updated the film because one thing, when you don't have G for George there, we soon realised that G for George doesn't appear in the film at all. So we got some very clever people, great, amazing artist from Poland who draws aviation aircraft, drew G for George for us to fill in the story, the gaps in the mission where George can appear. And that way visitors will be able to walk through the galleries, get that sort of chronological story as I was talking about, that 2-year journey, and then the story of the combat operation comes at the appropriate time in the galleries, and you get the full context of why they're there on 17th of December 1943, on what the day they call Black Thursday, rather than the exhibition just starting with on 17th of December 1943. You've got the full story of who, what, why, and where they came from and what they did to get there.
With this new, with like the redoing of the story, we're able to secure through the family of Bud Tingwell, like the rights to use his voice still. So it's the same voice, exact same thing the whole way through. So luckily that's like really special because he was actually a pilot during World War II in the Royal Australian Air Force. And we also included a reference to a German fighter pilot, which Emily's spoken about before, which is we've got like the Schnaufer tail fin, and it's got the various things on it. We included an incident on that very night where a 7 Squadron Lancaster of an RAF unit was shot down by Schnaufer using Schrager music, which is the vertically firing cannons, and we depicted that incident of him stalking that Lancaster and then coming up underneath it without the crew knowing, and then shooting up into its fuel tanks and detonating in the right wing, and it just collapses. And that's all based on the exact account from Schnaufer and his gunner who wrote that up. And that crew, 6 of those 7 men on that British bomber are Australians, and all of them had flown in G for George a few months earlier. So it's a G for George crew which had survived 460 Squadron, was selected for Pathfinder 7 Squadron, went to this new unit, and on their second mission, they're shot down on that night over Holland by a guy whose fin you can check out and learn about. So, and we consulted with 7 Squadron Association, with the association in the UK, and they confirmed for us the exact markings, the details, the serial number, the works, and we're able to get in touch with 2 of the family members are like these descendants. So that's what we do a lot behind the scenes. There's a lot of this interactions between like associations and individuals to help make sure the story's correct.
Thanks, G. Was there a question up the back?
Thanks all for a wonderful seminar. Garth, your gentleman Valentine, next to his, I think it was the DFC, was his little goldfish medal. Do you have a story about how he went down and how he may have been rescued or got to safety from there?
Yeah, so that was well spotted. I didn't put a little caption for it either. But there's a little badge, which is an unofficial badge called a Goldfish Club badge. And it's an unofficial thing which the guys would make and give to each other if you'd survived a ditching at sea or in a lake. And on the 4th of December 1943, on his 30th and final mission for his tour to then be out of the unit and do training or whatever, he was shot down by a German fighter plane based out of Athens. The fighter plane which shot him down is the exact type of fighter plane we've got in Bomber Command. It's a Messerschmitt G6 fighter plane. So the exact same one as what he was shot down by. The guy who shot him down was Fritz Gramotka, who later shot down another 40 plus aircraft and survived the war and died in the 1990s. But in the case of David Valentine Paul and his 3 crewmen, he was shot at by 2 fighter planes. The aircraft then dived to then try and use the rear gunner to shoot up at them. It didn't work. The rear gunner jumped out early and was killed. It was too late to pull his parachute. David Valentine Paul was able to successfully, at like 200 plus miles an hour, engage in Lorient Harbour in Greece in a emergency ditching at high speed. And he was able to ditch across this harbour in Greece, and the aircraft sank, and he and his 2 surviving crewmen got out of the aircraft, and then 2 German float planes landed next to them, and like in the movies, for you the war is over. They got on board the float planes and they were flown to Athens, and then they were put into trains and sent to Stalag Luft 3 to be in amongst Bomber Command, Coastal Command, Fighter Command, all the other air crews and stuff. And that's how come he got his goldfish badge after the war when they got to catch up with him. Yeah.
We have time for one more question from the audience, but I'll take one online. And this is for Emily Hyles. How have you found so many wonderful women? See what that person did?
Nice alliteration, thank you. You just have to look, I think, in this job. As Garth said before, I don't know the percentage, but a huge amount of what we do is good to know, but it won't appear in the exhibition. So if you look for things and you're inquisitive and you are interested in the content, which we are, and this exhibition, particularly Bomber Command or the Second World War generally, is deeply, deeply interesting, and you just can't get enough of it. So all you have to do is look and ask people questions, and if you ask the right way and you find the right person, I found a lady in the Country Women's Association of Victoria who sent me every single newsletter they had ever written. You know, ask and hopefully you shall receive. So you just have to look.
Great, thanks, Sam. Time for one last question. Yep, Eno again, last but not least.
This is a simple, straightforward one. What does the ME 109 from the old Anzac Hall feature in the Bomber Command display in the new Anzac Hall?
Yeah, absolutely it does. The ME 109 returns because we want to have some of the German aircraft on display as well to show what were the dangers that faced the Bomber Command crew. I mean, as we mentioned, 41% of the Australians who served in Bomber Command were killed, and by telling some of the stories of German aircraft and night fighter pilots helps explain some of the dangers that, or why it was so dangerous for them serving. It's very near the tail gunner display too, so it marries up nicely to the tail gunner's story.
Cheers, thanks, Locke. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes the presentation this afternoon. I hope you agree it's been a fascinating conversation. I've learnt a lot and I've worked here for 19 years. So I hope you have found it interesting as well. And really, too, I hope we've teased you enough with little breadcrumbs and Easter eggs to come back sometime next year to have a look at the new exhibitions when the new Anzac Hall opens up. We do have 25 minutes before the special VP Day last post ceremony begins outside in the commemorative area, so thank you. But that's just enough time to hit the AWM shop. There's lots of amazing publications written by myself, Lachlan, contributions from Garth and Emily, and of course you can also purchase, I was going to say pick up, but that implies for free, you can purchase a copy of WM magazine, the Memorial's new magazine, both in print and digital, and some of the stories we alluded to in our presentation this afternoon, you can peer in greater detail in the magazine. So thank you everyone for coming and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.